What's going on, guys? Hey, we have a really exciting video coming up. This is all about the Battle of Kyiv. The Battle of Kyiv happened early on in the full-scale invasion, Russia's full-scale invasion into Ukraine, and starting in February 2022, and it played a very influential role in shaping what current Kyiv looks like, what current Ukraine looks like, because of how Ukraine was able to defend itself. So this is really cool. It's from a YouTube channel called Kings and Generals, which actually got recommended to me. They've got a ton of subs, 4 million subs. This video has almost 6 million views. But I was recommended to watch this video from this channel. So very cool. And I believe United 24 is involved with it as well. So anyways, I'll tag them in the description. But before I do, I want to tell you a little story and something exciting that's happening. So one of my buddies from the fire department back in the town that I was living in before I came to Ukraine, it was a little town outside of Fort Worth, Texas. And I was in a fire department out there, and one of my buddies, his name's Peyton, shout out Peyton, he reached out to me yesterday and was telling me about this situation that he was just finished dealing with, basically. And he's kind of into this deep into uh this ice hockey realm of content and these forums, this ice hockey world, right? He played hockey growing up, blah blah blah. So apparently in this realm, this ice hockey like digital environment, there are a lot of Russian hackers, and they hacked him and actually messed a lot of things up for him in his I guess in his personal life. Like, they doxed him, they put all of his information out there, blah blah blah. So it got me thinking. I've used a VPN for a long time now. It's kind of mandatory when you live in Ukraine. You're making the content that I make. You've got to be safe about your internet usage, right? So I actually reached out to a company called NORDVPN, and NordVPN is the VPN company that I use. And I reached out to them and I asked, hey, would you be interested in doing some kind of a sponsorship? I have a smaller YouTube channel, like a sponsorship or partnership. I have a smaller YouTube channel, but I would love to recommend your services to my community. In exchange for like an affiliate link or some kind of official partner role or something cool like that, right? And to my surprise, they reached back out and they're like, yes, absolutely. Here's a specific discount for your community. Put this link in the description of your video. They'll get that discount and it'll support your channel, blah, blah, blah. So super cool. We've never had a sponsorship or partnership, or I don't even know what you would call it. We've never had this though for this channel. So I feel like I'm doing the Trump hands, huge. So very exciting. If you're not using a VPN, in all seriousness here, you don't even have to use what I'm recommending, but you should definitely be using a VPN. This is becoming more and more and more of a problem, to where VPNs are pretty much standard practice, especially in any kind of military, security, police, first responder roles, any kind of media roles. You're always going to be having people try to get your information. So just protect yourself, man. This is really cool. Shout out to NordVPN. Thank you. If you're interested in checking out a VPN, you want to support the channel, hit the link in the description. All right, guys, let's watch this video about the Battle of Kyiv. Like, share, subscribe. Little M1A1 Abrams action up there.
The Russian unprovoked and illegal invasion of Ukraine began in 2014.
I already love this channel. The Russian unprovoked and illegal invasion into Ukraine. Sold. Done. I love these guys.
But in 2022, it entered a full-scale phase. So far, our videos have been summaries of the most recent important events happening on the battlefield in Ukraine, along with crucial diplomatic, economic and political developments which have had a direct impact on this battlefield. But enough time has passed as the 3-day operation turned into a year-long bloody conflict, so we can start looking back at some of the most defining battles of the war. Undoubtedly, the Battle of Kyiv is at the top of this list. Despite the odds being stacked against it, Despite its chief allies lacking confidence in its abilities to prevent the Russian army from reaching its objectives, Ukraine was bracing for a battle to defend its capital, which may well be the defining moment of the Russo-Ukrainian War and Ukrainian statehood at large. After months of warnings from the United States and the United Kingdom about the imminent Russian invasion of Ukraine, after several ill-fated attempts to reach a diplomatic solution amidst Russia's uncompromising stance, after a long period of speculations, Vladimir Putin finally declared a so-called special military operation for demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine on February 24th.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима. И для этого мы будем стремиться к демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
The Russian army attacked Ukraine from the north towards Kyiv, from the north.
It's crazy to me that he can even speak without laughing at his own just absolute absurdity sometimes. Like, there's very few people that if I see photos of or videos of, I will start to get this kind of anger or hatred inside. That's one of them, dude. That one is one of them. I just start burning up. Whoa, 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 whoa.
Towards Kharkiv.
Sorry. Can't take me anywhere, dude.
From the southeast towards the Ukrainian-controlled part of Donbass, and from the south towards Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. Later, we will dedicate videos to the other most important battles of the war in Ukraine, but today our focus is Kyiv. The war started with a massive airstrike campaign by Russia on Ukrainian air defense systems, military bases, military aircraft, and critical infrastructure to cripple the Ukrainian military potential to respond, overwhelm Ukraine, and demonstrate the futility of any resistance in the face of the mighty Russian army and its sheer firepower. But before the start of a full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian command relocated much of its military equipment and personnel outside their usual bases, significantly decreasing the effectiveness of the initial Russian mass strike. Nevertheless, this did not force the Russian command to rethink its second step of moving its land forces into Ukraine. Investigations and reports of Western media indicate that Putin and his intelligence community were convinced that the Ukrainian government would be too weak to resist, the Ukrainian public would welcome the Russian army as liberators, and the Ukrainian military would collapse upon facing the Russian military. Hence, the Russian military prepared logistics for a short conflict, during which Kyiv was supposed to fall. This calculation went horribly wrong, as the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his government decided to stay and fight instead of relocating to Western Ukraine or Europe, as the Ukrainian public resisted the occupation. Thousands joined the territorial defense brigades, and the Ukrainian military proved to be a much more formidable foe than expected. Moreover, Kyiv specifically is a difficult place to invade. The city and its surroundings have many forests, rivers, numerous towns and villages, and narrow roads.
You know, Kyiv, and I want to make a video about this one day, but Kyiv and Rus, these are such old territories, such old historic regions, and there's been battles and conflicts in these areas for literally centuries, not decades, centuries. And the history of Kyiv specifically, and areas up like in Chernihiv and these really old places, that it's really interesting. And I guess my point is, it's been hard to attack Kyiv for a very long time, and there's reasons it hasn't fallen, and there's reasons it's been defended in the past. I don't know. So I'm a big fan of history. I'm a big fan of, medieval times and knights in shining armor and Vikings and all that really cool stuff. And there's so much of that history here in Ukraine, especially in these older towns. Kyiv's the oldest city in Europe, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments.
Between them, all factors beneficial for the defending side. Also, the weather in late February was warm, causing the snow to melt, creating muddy terrain, making it very difficult for heavily armored vehicles to move anywhere but on the roads. Commander of Kyiv's defense, Colonel General Alexander Syrski, ordered the erection of 2 rings of defense, a smaller one inside Kyiv and a larger one on the city's outskirts. Kyiv was divided into sectors, each getting a commander to manage the defenses. Artillery was deployed in the northwestern and northeastern outskirts of Kyiv. On February 24th, elements of the Russian 35th Combined Arms Army entered Ukraine through Chernobyl. Elements of the 36th Combined Arms Army advanced towards Chernihiv, while elements of the 41st Combined Arms Army invaded Sumy Oblast with a common goal of reaching the capital, Kyiv. An estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Russian soldiers moved in from the west bank of the Dnipro, while an additional 20,000 to 25,000 advanced on Kyiv from Chernihiv and Sumy Oblasts. The vicinity of Kyiv was defended only by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, elements of the Ukrainian National Guard, Special Forces, and newly established volunteer groups of the Territorial Defense Brigades. The Russian electronic warfare tools immediately disabled Ukrainian communications, but the reforms enacted in the Ukrainian army, making it more decentralized, allowed it to counter this. A reported 26,000 Ukrainian soldiers trained by the US and NATO since 2014 helped them to become more capable commanders and soldiers. As a result, the Ukrainian military was relatively prepared to operate when the advancing Russian army disabled their communications. Moreover, Elon Musk started supplying Ukraine with his Starlink satellite broadband service early in the war, allowing the Ukrainian military to find alternative communication methods. On the morning of February 24th, Russian columns started moving towards Kyiv from Chernobyl, Chernihiv and Sumy Oblasts. 2 days before that, the Ukrainian border patrols fell back towards Benevka, Vilcha, and the abandoned city of Chernobyl on the western bank of the Dnipro in anticipation of the reported 30 Russian battalion tactical groups, around 20,000 men, invading from this direction. Reportedly, these BTGs belonged to the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, the 98th Guards Airborne Division, and the 155th Separate Marine Brigade. The 1st Separate Battalion defended the notorious Chernobyl power plant, but it reportedly lacked heavy weapons.
This is so cool, dude. I love this kind of content. I don't know if this is a miss with the large portion of you guys, but what I have noticed, actually, every time I say that, you guys seem to be on my side about also enjoying the same stuff I enjoy. So maybe I'm wrong. Let me know in the comments if you like this stuff.
To oppose the Russian onslaught and was forced to surrender. At this point, elements of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, border patrol units, and 2 groups of Omega Special Unit were the main Ukrainian forces defending against the Russian attack on the western bank of the Dnipro. Russian units advancing in this direction enjoyed an immense firepower and manpower advantage, so stopping them was unrealistic. Taking that into account, the main goal of the Ukrainian defenders was to delay the Russian forces by destroying bridges and roads and harassing their lines. While most of the Russian force pushed back the Ukrainian defenders and advanced, 4 to 5 BTGs of the Russian army served as a vanguard unit, aiming to reach the Antonov airport in Hostomel by bypassing residential areas and avoiding Ukrainian forces. The supply lines of these forward units were vulnerable to hit-and-run attacks by Ukrainian mobile units armed with Javelin and NLAW anti-tank missiles. According to a Ukrainian participant in the Battle of Kyiv, the Russians were careless and moved in parade-like formations without units covering their advance and flanks. As a result, the Ukrainians successfully harassed Russian armored columns, which sometimes had to push through narrow roads, and this made the destruction of the front and rear vehicles sufficient to stop whole columns. Notable battles took place near Ivankiv and Dima, as the 72nd Brigade, the aforementioned Ukrainian units, territorial defense battalions, and special forces withdrew while delaying the Russian movement and inflicting damage on its lines. But Ukraine was suffering losses too. For instance, according to Ukrainian sources, the Omega Group of the National Guard had to abandon 3 of its vehicles, which Russian Spetsnaz groups later used to enter Kyiv. These vehicles still had Ukrainian insignia, allowing Russian Spetsnaz to enter the capital in the first chaotic days of the war. The number of Russian saboteurs in Kyiv is unclear, but Russian Spetsnaz operatives, Wagner mercenaries, and GRU operatives were in Kyiv to reportedly kill President Zelensky, wreak havoc in the capital, and create an illusion of a significant Russian presence in the city. Most of these saboteurs entered Kyiv in the early days of the conflict, including through Hostomel, which we will talk about a bit later. At the same time, it is claimed that a portion of the Russian agents entered the capital before the beginning of the war. One should remember that in February, the Ukrainian defeat was considered a matter of days. The Ukrainian government was expected to crumble under pressure, but Zelensky's defiance and refusal to leave the capital was a critical moment that helped mobilize the Ukrainians to fight. In the early days of the invasion, citizens were armed with guns and were encouraged to await Russian invaders with Molotov cocktails.
Here's something I think about sometimes, man. Say what you want about Zelensky, right? I've heard in the comments some people that don't like him, some people that do, and here in Ukraine, I know people that like him and Ukrainians that don't. But he did stand his ground, and what I wanted to say was, if the shoes were on the other feet or on the other foot, and the Ukrainians were surrounding or were pushing into Moscow, they were already in Moscow. Let's say the Ukrainians were in Moscow. Do you think Putin would stand his ground? Or would he hop in a helicopter and flee out the rear like we've seen so many of his allies do and Russians do time and time again in areas where they're getting pushed out? Zelensky didn't do that. and I mean, I don't know if Putin would either, but I have a feeling that he would.
Russian saboteurs failed in their mission in Kyiv. There were separate incidents of fighting inside Kyiv, most notably near the Berestayska metro station, but the situation inside of the city never became too threatening. Soon, the activity of Russian saboteurs died down. While the Russian columns were advancing from Belarus, Russia simultaneously deployed airborne troops to the Antonov airport in Hostomel, some 20 kilometers northwest of the capital. The Russian command assessed the earlier massive campaign of strikes on Ukrainian targets as sufficient to destroy most of its air defense capabilities. It was confident that it could deploy 200 to 300 elite paratroopers from the 11th Guards Assault Brigade deep behind the Ukrainian lines, with the help of Mi-8 HIP assault transport aircraft protected by 34 Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters. This operation aimed to secure the Antonov airport and use it as a foothold for deploying troops, military equipment, and supplies for the upcoming attack on Kyiv. The Antonov airport was defended by the 4th Rapid Response Brigade of the Ukrainian National Guard, which had around 300 soldiers, at this time primarily conscripts, as some of the most experienced soldiers were relocated to Luhansk Oblast, since Ukraine expected the most significant Russian attack from there. The 4th Rapid Response Brigade also reportedly possessed several T-64BV tanks, an artillery battery, surveillance drones, portable surface-to-air systems, and Zu-32-2 anti-aircraft weapons. Inexperienced Ukrainian defenders were reportedly overwhelmed and shocked at the beginning of the battle. Still, the mood changed as soon one of the Russian helicopters was shot down by an Igla man-portable surface-to-air missile.
Nice.
Overall, the Ukrainians managed to down 3 Russian helicopters. The Ukrainians fought hard to defend the airport, but the unit commander, Colonel Vitaly Rudenko, was forced to order a retreat since they ran out of ammo. As soon as the 4th Rapid Response Brigade withdrew, Ukrainian artillery started pounding the airport's landing strip to make it unusable for deploying additional troops and vehicles by Russia. Ukrainian Su-24 aircraft also joined the attack on the Antonov airport. This was followed by the attack of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, the 4th Rapid Response Brigade, and Ukrainian Special Forces to retake the airport. Ukrainian forces sieged the airport, where the Russian VDV was under heavy pressure from the Ukrainian artillery and air force. By the evening of February 24th, the 4th Rapid Response Brigade reported its victory in Hostomel, as the Russian 11th Guards Assault Brigade had to withdraw to the surrounding woods. Even though the Russian ground forces in and around the Hostomel airport did not get reinforcements to hold the area, the Russian air forces actively supported them. Battles in Ivankiv, Dima, and other areas northwest of Kyiv were raging simultaneously, but the group of 4 to 5 BTGs spearheading the Russian advance by bypassing the Ukrainian units and strongholds reached Hostomel on the morning of February 26th. The Ukrainians had to withdraw and create the next line of defense along the Irpin River, as their special forces detonated the nearest bridge, delaying the advance of the Russian units. Even though the Russians managed to secure the Antonov airport, its runway was severely damaged, making it useless for further Russian deployment, according to the Ukrainian command. There are conflicting reports about the Russian attempt to capture another airfield in the vicinity of Kyiv. According to Ukrainian officials, on February 26th, Russia sent 2 Il-76 transport airplanes to land Russian airborne troops at the Vasilkiv airport, which the Ukrainians shot down. So far, no conclusive evidence of 2 shot planes has been presented. But the Russians also attempted a ground assault on the airport, most likely conducted by the forward units coming from the north. The mayor of Vasilkiv also claimed that some of the Russian soldiers who fought to capture the airport were sleeper agents who moved to the Kyiv Oblast with their families a few months before the war. There is no public evidence to corroborate that claim, but a battle in Vasilkiv indeed took place. An interviewed Ukrainian soldier claimed that the Russian unit fighting in Vasilkiv was the Alpha group of the Russian Spetsnaz. On February 26th, the Ukrainians repelled their attack. The next targets of the Russian forward units were the towns of Hostomel, Bucha and Irpin. The Russians quickly overwhelmed the Ukrainian defense in Ivankiv and Dima by the end of February. That notorious 40-mile-long armored Russian column was advancing towards Kyiv to join the siege of Ukrainian forces along the Irpin River. As we mentioned earlier,
how many of you guys were watching this when this was going down, and you remember in the news watching those armored columns driving towards Kyiv? I remember that very well, sitting in my room and watching on the TV like, oh my God, they're going to Kyiv.
The commander of Kyiv's defense, Colonel General Alexander Syrsky, stated in an interview that there were 2 circles of defense of the capital. One of them was the outer circle, in villages and settlements of the Kyiv Oblast, while the inner circle was inside the city limits of Kyiv. This outer circle was Hostomel, Bucha, Irpin and Moschun, and the Ukrainian defenders were ordered to stand their ground to prevent the Russian advance into the capital. Losing this battle would mean urban combat in Kyiv. Knowing how the Russian army conducts urban warfare, namely massing artillery around the city and razing it to the ground, the Ukrainian command understood that they would have to keep the Russians at the perimeter to save Kyiv from destruction. As the destruction of numerous Ukrainian cities in the east showed, they were right in that assessment. In late February, battles for Hostomel, Bucha and Irpin started almost simultaneously, as Russian ground forces entered all 3 towns, looking to penetrate Ukrainian defenses and enter the capital. It is still difficult to determine the exact units fighting on both sides in these battles. Still, reports indicated that from the Russian side, these were the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade, 76th Guards Air Assault Division, 56th Guards Air Assault Regiment, 64th Motor Rifle Brigade, a Chechen National Guard regiment loyal to Kadyrov, and Special Forces.
Chechens.
At the same time, the Ukrainian defense consisted of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, the 112th Territorial Defense Brigade, several elements of the Ukrainian Special Forces and the National Guard, as well as the newly created International Brigade, which, contrary to the rumors, was not in the tens of thousands, but merely in the hundreds. On February 27th, while Russian units were still fighting to capture Hostomel, several broke through in the direction of Bucha and Irpin. In Irpin, the battle started outside the Giraffe shopping mall as a formidable armored column entered the town. But this column, reportedly belonging to the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, advanced through the road leading to Irpin, and the Ukrainian defenders were prepared. The Russians were still confident that the Ukrainians would crumble when they saw an overwhelming armored force and moved in a parade-like formation. As soon as the Russian armored column approached, Ukrainian paratroopers destroyed several Russian vehicles with RPGs, which quickly caused chaos in the Russian ranks. It is reported that Ukrainian defenders were learning how to use the Western-supplied javelins and NLAWs on YouTube on the fly, and used these anti-tank weapons to destroy the first and last vehicles in the columns. This tactic, successfully used by Chechen resistance in the Chechen wars of the 90s, was ideally suited for narrow roads in the suburbs of Kyiv, as destroying the first and last vehicle in the column forced other vehicles to choose between staying on the road or moving to muddy terrain, and either option could be deadly. surviving vehicles entered the shopping mall and hid behind other buildings to avoid destruction. With Ukrainian communications down, Ukrainian commanders passed instructions and targets for artillery fire via runners and WhatsApp. A Russian unit tried to flank the Ukrainians through a deserted brick factory, but their attempt was repelled. After 2 hours, the Russians had to withdraw. But the initial setback did not stop the Russians from continuing their attempts to take Irpin. On February 27th, Ukrainian defenders blew up the bridge connecting Bucha to Irpin. The invaders had to use the longer route through the M06 highway to bring more men and vehicles to Irpin. The Ukrainians were aware of this, and on February 28th, a Russian armored column suffered heavy losses on the M06 highway. A Ukrainian official, Alexei Arestovich, claimed that Russia lost more than 200 vehicles on the highway, which sounds like an exaggeration, but is also an indication of fierce resistance by Ukrainian forces in this direction. By early March, the Russians managed to gain a foothold in Irpin, but they failed to capture the town despite all their attempts. This led to increased Russian airstrikes on Irpin, bringing the town to the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. At one point in mid-March, it was reported that Russia managed to take half of the town under its control, but they never managed to drive the Ukrainian army out of Irpin. We still don't have a detailed step-by-step report of the battles in Irpin, but there was an episode that showed the negligence of the Russian units. A Russian airborne company parked its vehicles at the base of a multi-story building in Irpin and was visible to Ukrainian defenders. The Ukrainians threw smoke grenades at the Russian airborne company, which got confused and ran away in a panic, leaving all their vehicles and equipment behind for the Ukrainians. Heavy battles took place in Bucha as well. The 64th Separate Motorized Brigade, the 76th Guards Air Assault Division, pro-Kadyrov Chechen battalions, and riot control units known as OMON were among the units fighting to drive away the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, the Territorial Defense Units, the National Guard units, and the Special Forces. After the initial advance in late February and early March, amid significant losses in armored vehicles, Russia was pushed back to the outskirts of Bucha on March 3rd. But by March 5th, the Russians again took most of the town under their control. This allowed them to move troops to Irpin more freely. Heavy fighting in the northeast of Kyiv Oblast led to a catastrophic humanitarian situation, which prompted the authorities to organize the evacuation of up to 20,000 civilians on March 9th. On March 12th, it was reported that Russia finally captured Bucha. Despite several counterattacks, it was impossible to drive the Russian troops from the area. For the time being, the aim of the Ukrainian forces in this area was to prevent a Russian advance from Bucha to Irpin. After taking the Antonov airport in Hostomel on February 26th, Russian aviation and artillery continued shelling this town in preparation for a ground offensive. Despite the initial success of the Ukrainian defenders in repelling the assault of the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade, the highlights of which were the destruction of dozens of Russian armored vehicles and the killing of the deputy commander of the 41st Combined Arms Army, Major General Andrei Sukovetsky, by sniper fire on March 5th, Hostomel was captured by Russia. The mayor of Hostomel was killed
Dude, the snipers got him. Imagine being that sniper, dude. That's sick.
days later while delivering humanitarian aid to residents. For the next several weeks, the Ukrainians continued counter-offensive actions to retake Hostomel. The Russians heavily outnumbered the Ukrainian defenders in this direction, and it is reported that the deployment of the 80th Air Assault Brigade helped the Ukrainians to stabilize the situation in Kyiv Oblast. We do not want to diminish the significance of battles in other towns of the Kyiv Oblast. Still, perhaps the single most important victory of the Ukrainian army took place in the town of Moschun, immediately north of the capital. After the occupation of the Antonov airport, elements of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade entered Moschun in anticipation of a Russian attack from there. On February 27th, the Russian Spetsnaz troops were already in Moschun. Still, as the river Irpin separated Hostomel from Moschun and the bridge between these towns had been blown up, it was difficult for the Russian army to deploy a formidable force in this area. Ukraine had a natural advantage in this direction, and constantly targeted pontoon bridges via artillery and airstrikes to prevent the Russian units from moving to Moschun. For days, Russian deployment to Moschun was stopped, before, on March 6th, a large Russian group finally managed to enter the town. Despite the fierce resistance from the company of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, led by Captain Roman Kovalenko, they had to retreat to the edge of the town, allowing the Russian army to create a bridgehead in Moschun. He regrouped with Ukrainian Special Forces, territorial brigades, and newly arrived international volunteers. Both sides dug trenches in anticipation of battles for Moschun, and the Ukrainians had to find a way to prevent more Russian reinforcements from coming there. On March 8th, Ukrainian Special Forces did just that by blowing the dam in Dima at the mouth of the river Irpin, which significantly increased the water flow into the river, made it broader, and created boggy terrain on the banks. This made using existing pontoon bridges and building new ones very difficult. It became nearly impossible to bring additional manpower and armored vehicles into Moschun. But the situation for the Ukrainian defenders inside Moschun was already quite difficult. The Russians attacked Ukrainian positions with artillery, drones, helicopters, and airstrikes. Ukrainian communications were destroyed too, making Ukrainian drones mostly unusable. Ukrainian defenders in this region were running low on 152mm artillery shells. On March 10th to 11th, the situation became even worse, as according to an interview with one of the Ukrainian defenders, close to 100 Russians somehow managed to cross the Irpin with armored vehicles. They reportedly gathered in the forest in the north of Moschun, unbeknownst to the Ukrainian units. But a local farmer spotted a concentration of tanks and armored vehicles and informed the Ukrainian army about it. Ukrainian drones could not spot them. But once the Ukrainian artillery fired on the forest, they saw a secondary explosion, confirming the placement of vehicles there. Being exposed, the Russians pressed to attack. They moved south towards Kyiv, aiming to advance on Horenka and then Pushchevoditsa. The success of this movement would have meant the invasion of the capital from the north. The National Guard units were the first to engage with the advancing Russian soldiers. Then the company of the 72nd Brigade joined the fight. The Russians lacked night vision equipment, while the Ukrainians did not have armored vehicles. But equipped with NLAWs, they managed to destroy several IFVs. Ukrainian artillery was active too. After losing 20 to 30 men, the remaining Russian troops fled towards the river. But Moschun was still in danger. According to General Sirski, Moschun was on the brink of a fall, as the Russians managed to deploy their airborne troops to the settlement. Ukraine strengthened its defences with another battalion from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, but this brigade suffered heavy losses as Russian artillery and airstrikes continued. Russia reportedly had a 20-to-1 artillery advantage in the Kyiv Oblast. At one point, on March 21st, the commander of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, Alexander Vdovichenko, requested the commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, to withdraw from Moschun. Zaluzhny reportedly ordered Vdovichenko to fight no matter what, since the fall of Moschun would mean losing Kyiv and possibly the war. The 72nd Brigade and other defenders of Kyiv did precisely that. We don't have details of how the rest of the Battle of Moschun unfolded, but we know that the Ukrainians continued resisting and bleeding the Russians out with Stingers, TB2 drones, NLAWs, and javelins. In Bucha, Irpin, Hostomel, and Moschun, Ukrainian mobile units actively employed hit-and-run tactics to destroy Russian vehicles. The deployment of the 80th Air Assault Brigade helped offset the manpower advantage of the Russian army. It was looking increasingly unlikely that the Russians would manage to break through to Kyiv, as they could not even take Irpin and Moschun under complete control more than a month after the start of the invasion. Ukrainian units started counter-attacking movements in Irpin and Bucha. Almost simultaneously, Russian command informed about their intended de-escalation in Kyiv Oblast as a...
I mean, I genuinely think that not only this war, but specifically the early days of the war, are going to be studied in history books as a masterclass for defensive strategies, defensive tactics, counter-attack tactics. It's pretty amazing what especially when you get breakdowns like this, it's pretty amazing considering the excuse me, Ukraine wasn't even on the list of like the top 25 strongest military nations. Russia was number 2, supposedly. Russia was number 2. Ukraine's not even on the list. and Ukraine's stomping them out to this day. Oh, crazy.
A gesture of goodwill.
I love it.
In late March, early April, the Russians started to retreat from Kyiv Oblast, leaving a wake of destruction and death behind them. This is when the world found out about the Bucha massacre. Another critical battlefield of the Battle of
Bucha.
Kyiv was Makariv, a town west of Kyiv. It is on the E40 highway, which was reportedly crucial for transporting weapons and vehicles to the defenders of Kyiv from the west. In late February, the 37th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade entered Makariv and engaged in battle with the 14th Separate Mechanized Brigade and the 95th Air Assault Brigade. Heavy fighting continued for several days before, in early March, the Russians were pushed away from the bridge in Makariv towards the area known as the Makariv Dachas. March was tense in Makariv as Ukrainians harassed Russian columns with hit-and-run tactics, while the Russians constantly shelled the town. Towards the end of the month, the Russians launched another attack with armored vehicles and put immense pressure on Ukrainian units. It is reported that the Russians were repelled only after the arrival of a Special Forces unit of Ukraine. On March 29th, it was the Ukrainian turn to attack the Russian positions, but it did not bring any positive results for the Ukrainians. Nevertheless, 2 to 3 days later, the Russians withdrew from Makariv, just like from other occupied areas of the Kyiv Oblast. As we noted earlier in this video, Russia advanced from 2 other axes towards Kyiv, from Chernihiv Oblast and Sumy Oblast. Since our main focus in this video is Kyiv, we do not intend to describe all of the battles and processes that took place in the Chernihiv and Sumy Oblasts, as it is the topic of a future video. But let's briefly remind you about what happened in the Chernihiv and Sumy Oblasts to give context. On February 24th, elements of the 41st CAA, including the 90th Tank Brigade and the 55th Motor Rifle Brigade, invaded Chernihiv Oblast from Belarus. The Russians had 10 to 15,000 men on this axis. The Ukrainian 1st Tank Brigade, with some 2,000 men, was tasked with defending the city of Chernihiv and preventing the Russian advance on Kyiv. After initially failing to take the city of Chernihiv under control, the Russians decided to bypass and encircle the city, while also continuing their movement towards Kyiv. A similar scenario developed in the Sumy Oblast. A 10 to 15,000 strong Russian force faced fierce resistance from the 56th Motorized Brigade and the 150th Territorial Defense Battalion. Hence, in this direction, they also decided to bypass the Oblast center and continued advancing towards Kyiv, being stopped by the Ukrainian army in Zahurivka. This tactic overextended the Russian supply lines, making it vulnerable to hit-and-run tactics of the Ukrainian mobile units. On the Chernihiv axis, the key battle took place in the village of Lukashivka in mid-March. One Russian BTG, with around 750 people, 7 tanks and 19 armored infantry vehicles, tried to take this town to complete the encirclement of Chernihiv and cut the last highway connecting the city to Kyiv. But they ignored that the plains and villages around Lukashivka were still under Ukrainian control, making them vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery. Russia took heavy losses in this direction. Despite its inability to encircle Chernihiv, Russia still advanced on Kyiv from this direction. They went as far as Brovary, Kyiv Oblast. On March 9th, a battalion of the 72nd Brigade, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Roman Damashrai, prepared to ambush a Russian armored column from the 6th Guards Tank Regiment moving from Zalicia towards Brovary. Locals and Ukrainian reconnaissance drones informed about Russian movements, so the Ukrainian ambush unit was ready. The Ukrainians struck the first tank in the Russian column with NLAWs, causing confusion in the Russian ranks. Russian tanks moved onto the muddy roadside, which made their movement even more difficult. They became easy targets for the Ukrainians. Ukrainian Corsair missiles and artillery started pounding them. When the Russians retreated, they left 17 tanks, 3 other armored vehicles, and dozens of men on the battlefield. On March 19th, Russia made another attempt to take Brovary, but as soon as their first tank was hit, they retreated. Russian attempts to take Kyiv from the Chernihiv and Sumy Oblasts failed too, as they withdrew from the occupied areas in late March, early April. The Battle of Kyiv ended in a Ukrainian victory. Being significantly outnumbered and suffering from a firepower disadvantage did not prevent Ukraine from standing its ground and inflicting hefty damage on the Russians. Ultimately, the Kremlin understood that its losses were unsustainable, and that the available manpower and firepower were insufficient to break through the Ukrainian defenses of the capital. The fighters grew more confident and gained valuable experience as they kept holding the Russians back. Evidently, Russia intended to conduct a short, victorious war based on the dubious conviction that Ukrainians would welcome Russians as liberators. The Ukrainian military and the government would crumble in the face of the assumed second strongest army in the world. Russian logistics throughout the Battle of Kyiv was in shambles, which is proved by scores of images of Russian tanks out of fuel in the Kyiv Oblast. Russia was unprepared for a long war and did not make appropriate preparations. The Russians severely underestimated the Ukrainian army and evidently thought that this was still the same Ukrainian army of 2014. The Russians overextended their supply lines in the Battle of Kyiv with a goal in mind to advance on the capital no matter what. This left them vulnerable to Ukrainian mobile units, who regularly ambushed Russian armored columns. It was often enough to destroy the first vehicle in the column with RPGs like Javelin and Enlaw, which have the capability to strike from a significant distance. The rest was up to Ukrainian artillery, who targeted confused Russian tanks and other armored vehicles. For instance, it is reported that the infamous Russian 40-mile-long armored column saw 19 of its vehicles destroyed by artillery before it had to disperse. Also, the initial strike on the Ukrainian military infrastructure did not yield the results the Russians hoped for. Too many Ukrainian aircraft and air defense systems survived, as they were moved out of their bases in anticipation of an attack. This prevented the Russians from securing complete air domination. Instead, they saw the emergence of the myth of the Ghost of Kyiv, a collective identity of pilots who defended the sky of the capital from intruders. Moreover, stingers caused significant
I forgot about the Ghost of Kyiv, dude.
problems for Russian aircraft, a story carried over from the ill-fated Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Lastly, the Russian army demonstrated an almost complete inability to coordinate the work of different military branches. Hence, most of the Russian offensives were carried out by only 1 or 2 BTGs, which allowed the Ukrainians to adapt and prevent significant breakthroughs. The Ukrainian defense strategy of Kyiv primarily relied on the so-called tactic of trading space for time, retreating to urban settlements and bogging the Russians down in extremely costly and complicated urban warfare, while also employing small mobile units which harassed the Russian supply lines. Also, we should not overlook the morale component of this battle. The Ukrainian defenders knew precisely what they were fighting for.
Bingo.
But Russian soldiers expected a different welcome, and some were shocked when Ukrainians met them like fascists. Their morale has been low throughout the Kyiv battle and the Ukraine war. These factors forced the Russians to withdraw from Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts by early April to redeploy in Donbass, where they hoped that they could turn blasts by. These factors forced the Russians to withdraw from Kyiv, Chernihiv and Sumy oblasts by early April.
Dude, imagine if they still held all that territory. Oh my gosh. I guess I never really realized how far they got in. I didn't arrive to Ukraine until January of 2023. So all of this was going down. I was watching in the news.
April to redeploy in Donbass, where they hoped that they could turn the tide of the war. The Battle of Kyiv is one of the greatest upsets in military history. Despite expectations of the fall of the capital in 96 hours, the Ukrainian defenders stood tall and wrote their names into the pages of history. Kyiv did not fall. The Ukrainian military and the government did not crumble. This victory saved Ukrainian statehood and set the stage for further successes of the Ukrainian army in this war. More videos on the Russian invasion of Ukraine are on the way, so make sure you have subscribed and...
Legends, dude, that was so good. Go check out this channel, you guys. What's it called? Kings and Empires or something? Kings and Generals. Very cool. Dude, that was so sick. I love that. I just want to say something real quick, and then I'll end it because this is already a long video. Seeing all of those battles take place and drones not being utilized is crazy to me. There was so much fighting, so much what I consider to be old school fighting, like actual kinetic gunfights and which still happened, but it's just on a micro percentage of the scale that it did earlier on. It's absolutely absurd, man. Because all of this that we just saw, it's not capable anymore. You can't fight like that anymore. It is not a thing. Russia still tries every once in a while. They'll send a armored convoy of 6 or 7 armored vehicles. They get annihilated by FPV drones and dropper drones, and that's it. Wow, this is cool. This was really cool, man. It makes me proud to be here in Ukraine. It makes me proud to have fought for the Ukrainian armed forces and kind of be a part of the history that Ukraine's making. And I think there is room for Western countries to be the hero here. I think if a European country, and I've said this a lot in the past, but let's just say, for example, France stepped up, they put boots on the ground in Ukraine, or yeah, actually, no, they put boots on the ground in Ukraine. They showed up for Ukraine and the defense of Eastern Europe. That would go down in history as heroic, extremely heroic. The United States had that opportunity. That went away with the current administration. It looks like the UK is too scared to do anything and about anything. They've got enough going on in their own country right now that they can't seem to handle. And there's this power vacuum, if you will, and all the Western countries are too scared to act. Although the enemies of the free world, China, North Korea, Iran, none of them are scared to act. Russia and China and North Korea are all helping Iran right now. Iran, North Korea, and China are all helping Russia right now. There's North Korean troops, boots on the ground in Ukraine, or at least there were until they got schwacked. So they're not afraid to act. But the allies, what I consider to be the allies and Ukraine's allies and the Western nations are all too scared to do anything. They'd rather throw equipment and money from the sidelines and say, "Good luck, guys. Good luck. Fight them hard." Crazy, man. Anyways, that was so sick, man. I appreciate you guys. Also, check out our first partnership sponsor thing with NordVPN. Make sure your internet searches and stuff are secure. All right, guys. I love you. We'll see you in the next video.